Hello and welcome to Mind of the Forest, a podcast of the Louisiana Forestry Association. I'm your host, Jeff Zeringue. In Mind of the Forest, we talk about forestry, how important managed forests are to the environment, and the benefits they offer for wildlife and water protection. Those benefits are why the LFA promotes keeping Louisiana's almost 15 million acres of forests as forests. The forest products industry, including forest landowners, loggers, and wood manufacturers like lumber, paper, and pellet mills, plays an important role in the conservation and management of forests for the important renewable natural resource it is. This episode of Mind of the Forest is sponsored by First South Farm Credit. First South is your premier rural lender. With over 100 years financing timber and agriculture, they have the expertise you're looking for when financing rural property. If you're looking to purchase or refinance land, call your local First South Farm Credit office or find them online at firstsouthland.com. This is episode 63 of Mind of the Forest, and our guest is Emily E.J. Williams. She was the Southeast Director of Sustainable Forest Partnerships for the American Bird Conservancy. I say was because when we recorded this podcast in December, she was still working for the American Bird Conservancy, but now she is retired, so congratulations to EJ. So in her job with the American Bird Conservancy, EJ supported managed forests because the different species of birds need different aged forests to thrive, and she'll tell us all about that. Here's EJ. We have with us Emily Jo Williams, also known as EJ. She's the Southeast Director of Sustainable Forest Partnerships for the American Bird Conservancy. EJ, welcome. Glad to have you.
Thanks, Jeff. It's great to join you.
EJ has earned a bachelor's and master's degrees from University of Georgia in wildlife biology. She's a certified wildlife biologist and a graduate of the National Conservation Leadership Institute. You also, according to the American Bird Conservancy website, it's abcbird.org, I think?
That's correct.
Okay. It states that you are working to stop the decline of migratory birds and enable conservation throughout their life cycle. You've worked with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Longleaf Alliance, the Georgia Wildlife Resource Division. That's a little bit of your academic background and short work history, I guess, if you want to put a resume together. Tell us a little bit more about E.J. Williams. Where did your love for wildlife begin, and how did you turn that into a career?
I'm lucky for one thing, but I grew up in Georgia and grew up sort of hunting and fishing with my daddy and spending time outdoors. And I always loved wildlife and just always had, I think, a natural connection to the outdoors and especially the wild critters. And I was really fortunate. I really was going to pursue a career in marine biology. I love sharks and they fascinate me. And then when I got to the University of Georgia, I discovered the forestry school and wildlife biology. And that's how I was able to turn that sort of innate passion for wild critters into a career. And I've been really fortunate to have worked for different organizations. Mm-hmm. Gives you a different perspective, and then, it's able to, I think, bring things together in a way that you can help people understand how they can be part of wildlife conservation and what they can do.
What was your first job as a wildlife biologist?
My first, we used to call it your first real job.
Yes.
I worked while I was still in Athens at UGA, but graduated. I worked at the Southeastern Cooperative Wildlife Disease Study. So I got to do some science and look at just how animals survive in the wild despite having to deal with some, parasites and diseases and those kind of things. And then I moved on from that pretty quickly as a wildlife biologist with Georgia DNR. And I was actually up in the mountains in Northeast Georgia, and I had done my master's research on ruffed grouse, so that put me in the best place to continue to do some work with those, and then also just discover all the other cool critters that you can work with in Northeast Georgia.
How'd you narrow it down to birds specifically?
That kind of came about, I don't know, maybe by accident, but I had worked for the state just as a regional biologist, mm-hmm. and then we had a great state director that really wanted the agency to evolve and be more inclusive of all the animals. They had a really strong background in a lot of the things you hunted and fished for, but it was on the front end when people were realizing that a lot of the migratory birds were declining. And there was some really innovative research using weather radar and other things. And so the director of the agency was a birder, and he just said, we're gonna get serious about saving migratory birds. And they decided to add a position as the Partners in Flight coordinator, focused on those migratory birds. But I was not probably the perfect person for the job, but they wanted somebody that could help kind of bring that into the mainstream part of the agency. And since I had worked for them before as a wildlife biologist, I got that job as the Partners in Flight coordinator. And man, I have never looked back. That's led to just so many great opportunities and, partners and friends, and all focused on birds and bird habitat. It all comes together in the habitat, whether you're talking about deer or turkeys or wood thrushes. It's all about the habitat. And so that's kind of been my common thread, is how do you help people do habitat management and conservation in a way that works for the animals.
Working for the American Bird Conservancy, it's obvious you're a birder. Bird watching is one of your favorite things to do. Tell us about some of your experiences over the years, specifically in bird watching. What really made you gravitate to that and really expand on that?
So I was really fortunate all throughout my career with different jobs. I worked with American Bird Conservancy, not for, but with, and got to know that organization and what they meant for birds. And, I'm completely, I tell my friends I'm abnormal. There's no way once you get exposed to birds and you just see all the variety out there and you have some personal experiences with birds, you can never see the world the same. And I can tell you one of my earliest memories of birds, and it's way before I even knew it could be a profession. I did grow up hunting and fishing with my dad, and I can remember the first prothonotary warbler that we encountered, and we were fishing on Briar Creek, which is just a wonderful little natural stream, mostly in Georgia, and this bright yellow bird just came right down to the edge of the water and almost seemed curious and kind of followed us. And the kind of local name for it was swamp canary, which was perfect because it was just this incredibly yellow bird. And I can remember that to this day. And then, fast forward as I become a professional wildlife biologist, I learned how prothonotary warblers are dependent on wetlands, and they're one of the only warblers in the East that nest in a cavity, like a bluebird, and they like that cavity to be over water. And so, you take that early childhood memory, and all of a sudden you're figuring out how to work with people and have the right habitat for them on the landscape. And wetland conservation is what prothonotaries need, and keeping wetlands within managed forest systems. So, I go way back in terms of, my bird experiences. And then, so every time I see a prothonotary, that's almost a childhood memory for me. And they've got this beautiful song. So, it just connects everything.
You mentioned managed forest just a little bit ago. Let's talk about that for a bit. I do remember, and before we started recording, I kind of mentioned it because it was really so enjoyable for me. It was back in 2018. You came to Louisiana. IP had arranged a bird watching outing. Had a chance to take the trip. And one of the things I remember you saying was that various bird species needed the different stages of forest to thrive, and that managed forest really provided for those species and different for many of the different birds. Tell us a little bit about how do managed forests fit in with the conservation of birds?
They're ideal. The important thing, and we're so fortunate across the Southeast to have a lot of forests, and there are just a lot of forest dependent birds. But some birds need young forests, some birds need sort of middle-aged forests, and then some birds need older forests. And, for people that are owning and managing woodlands and forest land, every management decision they make will have some kind of habitat outcome. And, so if you start with, say, a harvest, and then you're going to replant that stand,
Hmm.
as soon as the older forest is gone and, grasses and forbs start to come up and it's really open, things like field sparrows will move right in. And even northern bobwhites will start to use that really open condition. And then as, you replant and the little trees and the shrubs and the other things start to grow, then you get things like prairie warblers and indigo bunting, yellow-breasted chats. And if you've left some dead trees standing, some nice little snags, then you're going to have bluebirds and great crested flycatchers. You might have a hawk perching. And so, as the forest grows, just the conditions change. And that young forest is particularly important because a lot of those birds, like prairie warblers, they may only use that forest until it's 8 or 10 years old. And then as the trees get older and the, canopy starts to close a little, they'll look for another young forest. But some other birds will move into that more closed condition. Sometimes Swainson's warblers and ovenbirds, some of these just beautiful little birds will move into that. And then, as the forest grows, we typically like to thin and, maybe get some early income out of it. But then opening that stand up really brings in a whole different suite of birds. And you might get red-headed woodpeckers and, bluebirds will move in there. And then, as the forest gets older and the trees get more mature, then you've got different birds that come in that stage, maybe yellow-billed cuckoos. One of the birds I work with a lot, Jeff, and have some great partners that help us with it is swallowtail kites. They use all those stages too. They're a big raptor. They're black and white. They've got about a 4-foot wingspan, 12-inch long tail. They love to forage over young forests and eat big insects and even little, snakes, baby birds. On that sort of middle-aged forest, they'll fly along the edge of the forest and pick frogs and snakes off of limbs. But then they've got to have some big trees for their nests. And so, all those things come together. And if you've got all those things across the landscape, then the birds can move to find the conditions they need. The important thing is that it's forest. And a stand condition might change, but over time, those stands will evolve, and it's a big mosaic of conditions that provides for a lot of different birds and other wildlife.
So the species, as is normal, will seek out the habitat that best suits their needs.
Exactly. And a lot of times they don't need just one condition. It's real interesting. We know from some research that some of the birds that nest in a young forest, as soon as their little chicks hatch and they start moving around with them, they'll move to an older forest. And then the opposite happens with like wood thrush. They're going to nest in an older forest with a nice understory. But once their little ones fledge and start flying around, they'll move them into a young stand to teach them how to feed themselves. So it's not a one size fits all. It's that diversity of habitats that provides for a diversity of birds.
Wow. So it sounds like managed forests are really ideal for many of the species.
They are. And again, that sort of change, when you've got a lot of different conditions, you've got different food sources and you've got different, both animal, insect and other. And then you've also got different berries and seeds from grasses and forbs. So yeah, that sort of turnover energizes the system. And especially in the South, naturally, a lot of our systems would have been fire dependent. And so that stage when landowners can go in and thin a stand, boy, if you can follow that up with fire, there's a whole suite of species that just respond to what you get that comes in after a fire.
Wow. So you mentioned that about prescribed burning. A lot of landowners I've visited with over the years, they talk about wildlife. That's an important factor in how they manage their land. Of course, many of them have consulting foresters to help them, but many of them don't. So what are some of the things that landowners can do if they don't have a forester? What are some of the things that they can do to help improve their forests for birds?
Well, there's so many programs now. There's some farm bill programs, USDA through NRCS and the Natural Resource Conservation Service and the Farm Service Agency. And they can get some technical assistance through those programs. So I encourage people to work with either their local, NRCS office extension service. Oh my gosh, that is such a resource that people can take advantage of. A lot of state wildlife agencies they typically call them private lands biologists, but they have people dedicated to working with landowners. And so, certainly, consulting foresters, through some of our partnerships, we work with some of the wood suppliers. And so their title isn't necessarily forest consultant, but that's exactly what they do. In addition to the harvest services they may provide, they're also available to help with recommendations for replanting and recommendations for wildlife.
In Louisiana, when it comes to wildlife, we often hear of the game animals, hunting and fishing, of course, on their property, many mammals and some of the ground birds, kind of like turkeys and things like that. But that's still a game animal. How would you encourage landowners who might not yet have taken up the interest in bird watching? How would you encourage them to do so?
Oh, wow. I don't see how people can't bird watch, especially in the spring when it's just so alive with birds and, it's the breeding season. So they're all singing. And so in between those turkey gobbles, there's probably 20 different species that are singing and moving around. So I encourage people just to sort of, one, use your ears, and, start to listen. And a lot of the birds that people have in their backyards, like northern cardinals and Carolina wrens, eastern bluebirds, the real familiar stuff, they're in those managed forests as well. And that's a good starting point. If you learn your backyard birds, you've got a good jumping off point for learning more birds. The other thing that's incredible now is there's an app for your phone called Merlin. And it was developed by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which it doesn't get any better than the Cornell Lab in terms of, knowledge. And they have sound laboratories. And they've developed an app that you can turn it on and it will tell you the birds that are singing.
Really?
And it's amazing and it is accurate. And what it'll do is you'll turn it on, and it also has two kind of paths. It's got one path that'll help you identify birds that based on what you're seeing, and it'll take into account size and habitat. Are they in a tree? Are they in a shrub? Are they on the ground? Color. So it'll help you that way. But then it's got this other path that will help you with those sounds. And what it'll do, you'll turn it on and tell it to listen, and it will, when it hears a bird, like maybe a white-eyed vireo, that will show on your screen. And then it might hear a northern cardinal. It'll add that, and it'll just keep adding birds. But every time that white-eyed vireo sings, it highlights it. And every time the cardinal sings, it highlights it. So even, the best thing to do is go out with somebody that knows their birds, and let them be able to say, here's what you're hearing. You're hearing a northern cardinal. It sounds like little nickels hitting together. Or you're hearing a Carolina wren, and they're saying cheeseburger, cheeseburger, cheeseburger. But that Cornell app, even if you're by yourself, can really help you start to get a feel for what the different birds sound like and what's, in your area, whether you're in your forest or your backyard.
That is curious. That is one of the things, another thing rather, that I remember when we had our outing back in 2018. It was bird watching, but as bird listening, as I recall. And we were able to see a few things that I thought was just marvelous. And probably the most exciting thing for me was the painted bunting. We did not expect to be able to see it.
Right.
But it was right above us, and we watched it for a great long time. But I do remember the part that when you're saying that you listen for the birds, and you probably encounter more listening than actually seeing. Am I remembering that correctly?
Absolutely. Even when we do bird surveys, and to better understand birds, you might hear 25 different bird species, but you may only see one or two. So the birds, because some birds are sort of cryptic and hiding, and you just won't see them, but you can hear them because especially in the spring and summer, because they're singing, birds sing for a reason.
Hmm.
And mostly the male birds sing to establish their territories, to attract a mate, then to, once they've attracted a female, they've got to kind of keep her close. And so they sing and use all kinds of little sounds to maintain that pair bond. And then once they've got young birds, they use all their little sounds for communication. So yeah, you can always tell a lot more about what's going on around with birds because of their songs and their sound.
So I guess sometimes, kind of like people, communication is important in relationship.
Absolutely.
Sorry, bad pun. But it really is a fascinating thing. The Cornell app. Let's get back to that a little bit. Anybody can download this and put that on their phone, and they can do that rather in the backyard or even in the forest.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's a free app. It's
That's what I
called
was. I was going to ask. Is there a subscription associated with it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure if you type in Merlin in the app store, it'll pop right up. It's got a profile of a bird flying, and yeah, it's totally available and free of charge, and works like a charm.
What are some of the other things about managed forests that are just ideal for birds?
Well, I think back to kind of the bottom line is the diversity,
Hmm.
and really, just kind of I don't think there's anything such thing as a standard management, but sort of typical management provides a lot of different habitat niches, and just the act of managing the forest, and what we see with the southeast. But then there's some specialized things people can do that even increase that value. And I don't know why we're a little too neat sometimes. So one of my big recommendations for people is to keep it messy. And when we harvested the forest, leave brush piles and use. Usually people use herbicides for some site prep, but use just the amount you need to give, if you're favoring pines, to give them a jump. But all those other little grasses and flowers and shrubs, those create more food sources and hiding places. Because for every little songbird that's out there, there's something that's probably trying to eat it, some kind of hawk. And so, you've got that, you need cover. Another thing that comes with managed forests with care is snags. There are at least 20 species that nest in cavities, and typically those are in dead trees. And so dead trees provide just all these little homes and roosts. At night, birds that nest in a cavity also spend the night in the cavities. So leaving dead trees is really important. And of course, that also has a whole bunch of insects. There's always going to be foraging opportunities for woodpeckers and other species that are, getting those insects from the dying trees. Streamside zones, again, our southeastern forests are such a wonderful landscape of uplands and bottomlands. And so those bottomland forests, they can serve as travel corridors. They tend to have a completely different vegetation community. They'll typically have a lot of oaks, which are really important to game and non-game species. And so those stream corridors that go through landscapes, whether they're small, maybe ephemeral streams that are only wet part of the year, on up to bigger creeks and rivers, those are so important for diversity. And there's just a different crew of birds that uses those hardwoods. So those hardwood areas are important. So you just get all that across the landscape.
I would like if you could, and you talked about the experience when you were a little girl and seeing that forest canary, I think.
Prothonotary warbler.
Okay. What would you say? Tell us about I guess maybe your favorite experience of bird watching and what you encountered.
Oh, wow. There's so many, that we always joke in the bird community about, well, so what's your favorite bird?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think if you tied me down to a railroad track with a train coming, I could pick just one. But and I've been fortunate to have a lot of experiences. But I will tell you, one of my favorites is, again, we do some work with swallowtail kites, and so I've been so fortunate to work with people that are talented and knowledgeable, and we capture swallowtail kites. And put radio transmitters on them that help us understand how they use the southeastern landscape when they're breeding. But then we're also able to follow those birds as they move through Central America down to South America, and they typically winter in Brazil. And so being able to see those birds, because they're spectacular. If we're out with a group of, I don't care if it's landowners or loggers, anybody, and a swallowtail kite flies in, it changes the conversation. They're just so striking. And so that's one of the reasons they're one of my favorites. They just really get people's attention.
Mm-hmm.
And people tend to go from, that's an interesting bird, to what can I do for that bird? And so I've had a number of experiences where that kite flies in, and we're able to observe it. And you can find their nest. And so I've also been able to watch swallowtail kites actually feed their little chicks. So you got this little 8-inch tall white buzzball in the top of a cypress tree with this elegant raptor coming in and dropping food off. And I mean, it is just amazing to be able to watch that. And then top that off with working with scientists that capture them, and you actually get to have that bird in hand.
Wow.
It's just life-changing.
That is incredible. We were fortunate that, and you were one of the contributors in writing a story a year ago in Forest and People. That was absolutely fascinating. The fact that the thousands of miles that this bird flies just in its normal migration is absolutely incredible. I enjoy that. I appreciate y'all contributing to that.
No, that was enjoyable. It was fun to write. And of course, Dr. Jennifer Coulson that helped write that is just such a wonderful person and to work with, and just so dedicated.
And they have some in Louisiana, especially in the southeastern part of the state, I think, right?
They did, yeah. We've got them in the southeastern part of the state. Jennifer's been doing a lot of work, particularly on the Pearl River in Louisiana. But they're in other places as well. And then we work, as you move east, we work with the Avian Research and Conservation Institute, and have been catching kites in South Carolina, Georgia, and a little bit in Florida.
Are they a stressed species, or?
It's really interesting, Jeff. At one point, we thought that they were in trouble. And historically, like back late 1800s, early 1900s, swallowtail kites nested all throughout the southeast and up through the Mississippi, or the middle of the country, up into the lake states. And we don't know exactly why, but somewhere by about the 1930s, their population had just essentially declined drastically. And now they're only found nesting from essentially North Carolina, across the southeast, down through most of Florida, and then over to Louisiana and East Texas. And probably one of the reasons I'm sure some of the forest loss that happened, in the Mississippi Valley to agriculture, there's been a lot of restoration work done. But kites are really social. Dr. Ken Meyer that we work with in Florida says the most important aspect of kite habitat is another kite. So they're really social, and they tend to nest in sort of loose neighborhoods. So when they come back from Brazil, they tend to go back to the same places year after year because they know there'll be other kites there. And so we think that's one reason they haven't sort of expanded more, is that social nature just kind of keeps them hugging that southeastern, coastline. But the cool thing about kites is when I first started working with them, 20-something years ago, we thought they were headed towards perhaps listing status. And we were starting to work with people proactively on conservation agreements. And then as we've been able to observe them, and we've got some really good survey techniques, their population has been gradually increasing. And at one point, again, maybe 20, 30 years ago, we thought they only used kind of pristine bottomland areas. Now we know they use managed forests readily and thrive in those. And their population has gone from perhaps a low of 10 to 12,000 to now our estimates are 24 to 27,000 swallowtail kites.
Wow.
But compare compared to some things that have millions, it's still a sort of low number, but we feel like if we can keep forests on the landscape and be sure that we provide those big trees, kites are in a good place and, they're stable and increasing slightly.
Well, that's a success story without having any kind of government program step in and say.
Absolutely.
I think that attests to the power of people if they really want to do something that they can.
I totally agree. And that when science comes together with people that have the ability to manage the land and, have a working and productive and sustainable forest, then you get those wins.
And we see more and more forests in Louisiana. It's grown over the years, so that's always a great thing to see. And more people are starting to manage their forests. So I think it's very encouraging for most wildlife, especially for birds. So I guess we'll see more of that.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And the good news is, Jeff, I don't work a lot with game species just because so many people do.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously that's an important use of the land. And that's a lot of the reason that landowners have their land is so they can, have recreational opportunities. But everything we recommend for the songbirds is going to usually be even better for game bird species and game species like deer. So, we like wider streamside zones for the birds, but deer thrive in those. And, leaving oaks on the landscape and making sure there's a good hardwood component. That's an important food resource for deer and bear and turkeys. So, it's good wildlife habitat is good wildlife habitat. So when you think about some of the specialized needs for the birds, that's also going to be really good for, game species.
Well, and EJ, we did hear a little bit of, I don't want to call it bad news, just transitional news for you. How long have you been with the Bird Conservancy?
I'm going to be retiring at the end of the year.
Yeah, but that's not, well, of course, you're going to have many more years with wildlife anyway, correct?
I will. I've got a few things lined up for this spring with forest tours and, getting out on the land with people. But I'm also going to have more time to go fishing and travel and do some hunting as well. And so, yeah, it's a transition, but I'm excited.
Well, we wish you all the best in your new endeavors, and we thank you for so many years with conservation, and especially working with managed forests. And especially today, I really appreciate you taking time out. We're recording this right before Christmas, and this is going to be dropped in January. So as far as the holiday break, we wish you and your family all the best with that.
Same to you, and good luck, and hope everybody has a lot of opportunities in the new year to get out and enjoy the forest.
EJ Williams, Emily Jo Williams, she is the now retiring Southeast Director of Sustainable Forest Partnerships for the American Bird Conservancy. Thank you again so much for joining us.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you for listening to Mind of the Forest. This episode was sponsored by First South Farm Credit. First South is your premier rural lender. With over 100 years financing timber and agriculture, they have the expertise you're looking for when financing rural property. If you're looking to purchase or refinance land, call your local First South Farm Credit office, or you can find them online at firstsouthland.com. If you'd like to learn more about sustainable forestry, the SFI, the LFA and its programs, and how you can be part of an organization that supports landowners, loggers, and the forest products industry in Louisiana, check out our website. That's laforestry.com. We have a great lineup coming up for 2026, some of which include a conversation with an LSU professor and researcher developing a bait to combat the feral hog problem in Louisiana, and an update on the brown spot needle blight that's affecting pine trees in Louisiana and the region. Of course, we're always looking for topics that might be of interest to you, our audience. And if you have a suggestion, please send it my way. You can send it to email at jzeringue@laforestry.com. That's jzeringue@laforestry.com. If you have any questions about being a Mind of the Forest sponsor, we have 14 shows each year, and we invite you to inquire possibly about being a sponsor. Drop me an email at the same email address, jzeringue@laforestry.com. And don't forget to check out our show notes where we leave the contact information for us and our guest. Also, you can subscribe to Mind of the Forest by clicking on the subscribe button on your favorite podcast app. And be sure to tap on the notification button as well. That way you'll know when we drop a new episode each month. We thank you very much for doing that. And remember, at the Louisiana Forestry Association, we're Mind of the Forest for you.